Hi guys, welcome to our channel. This is Science Lectures and my name is Boite Victor Chisa. I will be taking you through cell biology. So I think let's start off. Thank you. So cell biology, under cell biology, we are going to cover some basic things. So first of all, cell biology will be the biology of a cell. We are going to talk about a cell and the basics of the cell. So we need to know the cell structure. We shall cover the cell structure. Then that will be for the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. Then we'll have some basics on microscopy. So we'll study microscopes. That is the electron microscope, the light microscope, and their details, mode of operation, so on and so forth. Then we'll also look at cell communication. So we'll cover also that bit of cell communication. So under the cell structure, we expect to see the prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell. But before we see that, we need to define what a cell is. So the definition of a cell can be defined in different ways. But we can define it as a basic functional unit of life. So a cell is a basic functional unit of life. So it is basic and functional. So in other words, all processes within multicellular organisms stem from the cell. That's why we say it's functional and basic. So someone else can define a cell. We can also define a cell as a building block. We can define them as building blocks of life. So a cell can be defined also as a building block of life. So cells are basic functional unit of life. Then they are building blocks of life. So building blocks of life, that means the simplest living thing is a cell. So the simplest living thing is a cell. Let it be a bacterial cell, or an animal cell, or an animal cell. So the smallest, simplest living thing is a cell. That is it basically. So let it be bacterial cell, animal cell. In the evolutionary history, evolution will show us that the first thing to evolve probably has to be a cell, because it is what is building life. It is a building block of life. Then maybe what else we need to know is that under the cell, when we are talking about the cell, we don't have to forget the cell theory. So you can be asked a question to give the components of the cell theory. And under the components of the cell theory, one basic thing we need to know is that cells are fundamental units of life. Fundamental units of life. So that is one aspect. That is one aspect of the cell theory. Cells are fundamental units of life. So all life stems from what we know as a cell. Then maybe another thing we need to know about the cell theory is that cells form from pre-existing cells. So a cell forms from already existing cells. Why? Because a cell, if we have our cell, let's say this is cell A, cell B. If cell B is to be our daughter cell, it has to come from cell A. Why? Because cell A contains what we call the genetic component, or DNA. Briefly, we can call it DNA, which is used for coding other cells. So a cell stores the basic information for formation of other cells. But in the cell theory, what we need to know is that cells form from pre-existing cells or already existing cells. So a cell gives rise to another cell. Then another thing we need to know about the cell theory is that a cell is a basic functional. So cells are defined are basic functional units. So this implies that all metabolic processes in the body will take place from the cells, will take place in the cells because cells are the functional units of the body. So basic processes, which basic processes am I talking about? I'm talking about basic processes like metabolism, which metabolism involves the breakdown of nutrients, breakdown or joining or formation of the nutrients. Then that is metabolism. Then cells can also do one of the basic functions we say is metabolism. Then cells can also give rise to other cells. Give rise to other cells. So these cells can also give rise to other cells. So that is it for, these are one of the components, these are among the components of the cell theory. Fundamental units of life, as cells being fundamental, then cells are forming from the pre-existing cells, then they are the basic functional units of life. Then maybe what else we need to know about the cells is that when these cells organized in multicellular organisms, carry out specific functions. So if we have cells organized in a multicellular organism, they will form a group of cells organized, we call them a tissue. And that tissue will have cells differentiated, organized into specific cells that are capable of carrying out a specific function. So that is also important for us to note in the cell theory. So types, we are going to look at the types of cells. And cells are basically divided into two types. We have the prokaryotic cell, and then we have the eukaryotic cell, eukaryotic cell also as another type of cell. So these two types of cells are different, are very different. So prokaryotes and eukaryotes differ in some way or the other. Prokaryotes are basically, you will find them as cells that are small in size. They are small in size, commonly ranging from 1 to 5 micrometers. Then eukaryotic cells, they are at least large in size as compared to the prokaryotic cells. They are always around 10 to 100 micrometers. But again, the basic difference between a prokaryotic cell and the eukaryotic cell is in the location of the genetic component, that is their DNA. For the prokaryotic cell, the DNA is located in a region called the nucleoid region. So in other words, the DNA of the prokaryote is not surrounded by a double membrane by a double membrane organelle called the nuclear membrane. But again, for the DNA of the eukaryotic cell will be found in the nucleus, will be enclosed in the nucleus. And this nucleus is double membraned. So it's a double membraned nucleus where we will find our DNA enclosed in the eukaryotic cell. So those are the basic differences between the eukaryotic and the prokaryotic cell. But again, we can have some other differences between the eukaryotic cell and a prokaryotic cell, as we'll see. The basic example of a prokaryotic cell I can give is a bacterial cell. Bacterial cell is a prokaryotic cell, simply because its DNA is not enclosed by the double membrane nucleus, as we said for eukaryotes. Then an eukaryotic cell, an example I can give are the human cells. Basic one, I can talk of the red blood cell. This one is an eukaryotic cell. Then I can talk of any other cell within the, but again we have cells, we didn't mention that cells, a cell can either exist as a single organism, or they can exist in colonies, or a combination of cells working together. So that one is also important for us to note before we go further. So what again do we need to look at here? The interesting thing is that these two cells also have what they share in common, the eukaryotic cell and the prokaryotic cell. So shared, we can call them shared characteristics of these two cells. So what do you think is shared by these two cells? One is the genetic component, the DNA, is shared by both cells. So a prokaryotic cell will possess a DNA which we said is located in the nucleoid region. Then also the eukaryotic cell will possess a DNA which we said is found in the nucleus. Why is DNA shared among both? Is because for them to reproduce, like we said, for them to reproduce or to multiply, they need this genetic component because it stores the information, for their development and growth of these cells. So they share DNA as the basic component, they share genetic component because they need to have this genetic component in them. Then another thing shared by these two cells is the proteins. Proteins, as in fact we can call them briefly structural proteins. Their structure is supported by proteins. A structure of the eukaryotic cell and a structure of the prokaryotic cell will both be supported by the proteins, like we are saying. So if you look at the structure of the eukaryotic cell, you will realize that it has proteins that span via the entire membrane, and it will have also proteins that are on the surface of them. But the supporting structures mainly are the proteins that will support this structure. Then another similarity these cells will have is that they possess what we call a cell membrane. So they both possess a cell membrane. So a cell membrane is present in the prokaryotic cell. It is as well present in the eukaryotic cell, like we will see. So if you look at the basic structure of the prokaryote, though it is complicated, having some other external features, but it also possesses the cell membrane, and also the eukaryotic possesses the cell membrane, because this cell membrane is required for limiting entry of substances, and allowing entry of substances in and out of the cell. So it allows entry, it limits entry, it can limit as well allow. That is why it is called semi-permeable. That is why we describe it as being semi-permeable, a semi-permeable membrane. But it is important to note that it is present in both the prokaryotes and in both the eukaryotes. Then another basic thing shared by the two is that both cells require energy in form of ATP for their processes, for the internal processes. So they need to process energy in form of adenosine triphosphate, which is ATP, for their processes to move on. Remember, there are many processes that will take place inside the cell, not leaving transport aside, which will be covered in one of our future lectures. For transport to happen, probably we are to talk about active transport. For active transport to happen, we need energy in form of ATP for that process to be effected. So they will both utilize ATP. So these are some of the basic similarities between the eukaryote and the prokaryotic cell.